I try to avoid that, but I think it's unavoidable.
You know, I can't do this forever. I've been doing it since I was 21. As you move into your 80s, you say, hey, that's enough.
Hollywood once hailed him as the perfect face of American cinema, a blonde-haired man with piercing eyes, both intellectual and romantic. Robert Redford was not only the star of timeless classics like Butch Cassidy and The Sundance Kid and The Sting, but also an Oscar-winning director, a bold producer, and the founder of Sundance, a global symbol of independent filmmaking. He seemed to have it all: fame, power, and a career spanning more than 6 decades. But behind the halo of glory lay a very different story. A childhood haunted by illness and sudden deaths. A marriage that lasted 27 years but ended quietly. 2 sons lost along the way, leaving wounds that never healed. And a secret love that Redford kept hidden for decades, only admitting to when he was nearly 90. So who is Robert Redford? An immortal star of Hollywood, or just a man burdened by too many losses, spending a lifetime chasing peace he never fully found? If Robert Redford ever made you believe in the charm of classic cinema or touched your heart through a role, hit like as a tribute. Because behind Hollywood's dazzling light, he too carried tragedies few could ever imagine. Early life. Robert Redford was born on August 18, 1936, in Santa Monica, California. He grew up in a modest working-class family during a time when America was still struggling with the aftermath of the Great Depression. His father, Charles Redford, worked as an accountant for Standard Oil, a steady job, but never one of abundance. His mother, Martha Hart, was the heart of the family, gentle, resilient, and the one who instilled in her son the belief that he was destined for something greater. From an early age, Robert felt different. He showed little interest in school, often drifting off in class, but with a pencil in his hand to draw, or a baseball or tennis racket, he became someone else entirely. Passionate, energetic, tireless. Art and sports were the only places where he felt truly alive, yet his childhood was soon overshadowed by sudden loss. In 1945, when Redford was just 8, the family received devastating news. His uncle, David Redford, had been killed in the Battle of the Bulge. To young Robert, David was more than an uncle. He was a hero, a talented athlete, fluent in 4 languages, a man of adventure and courage in the military. His sudden death left Robert with his first life lesson in grief. Death could strike anyone, even the strongest. 3 years later, tragedy struck again. One morning, at the age of 11, Robert woke to find he couldn't move. His eyelids were heavy, his body paralyzed. Doctors diagnosed him with polio, a disease that terrified America in the years before a vaccine existed. For 2 weeks, he lay bedridden, a torment for such a restless child. He listened to his own breathing, wondering if he would ever run or paint again. Though he recovered, the memory of being trapped inside a fragile body never left him. It taught him an early harsh truth. Life is fragile, and survival requires resilience. The greatest loss came in 1955. At just 18, Redford lost his mother, Martha, who died at 40 from complications following childbirth. 8 years earlier, she had given birth to twins who did not survive, and the medical consequences lingered until they ultimately claimed her life. For Redford, it was more than losing a mother. It was losing his closest friend, the one person who always believed in his talent. He later recalled, "My mother always believed I could do something, even when I didn't believe in myself." With her gone, he lost his most vital source of emotional support. In his Irish-Scottish family, emotions were rarely expressed. His father, Charles, never wept or complained. Relatives did not discuss grief. Pain was met with silence, and life went on. In that environment, Redford was forced to learn how to endure in solitude. He kept his anguish locked inside, turning it into a quiet strength. This inner discipline later gave his art a rare depth, the ability to channel unspoken pain into a glance, a gesture, a performance. The string of losses, his uncle's death, his illness, his mother's passing, left scars that never fully healed. He grew up in silence, in a family unaccustomed to voicing sorrow, and learned to swallow grief whole. From that silence came a restless urgency, a need to rebel, to break free from constraints, to carve his own destiny. Early career. The wounds of childhood left Robert Redford with a restless, unsettled spirit. By the time he reached young adulthood, he carried within him an urgent need to break free from the dull framework of ordinary life, to fight against the constant sense of fragility looming over him. His youth began as an act of rebellion. At Van Nuys High School, he was known not for academic excellence, but for his athletic ability and a streak of defiance. Among his classmates was Natalie Wood, who would later become a major star and his co-star. But at that time, Redford had no inkling that Hollywood would one day beckon him. He earned a baseball scholarship to the University of Colorado thanks to his skills on the field, seemingly set for a stable career in sports. Yet, in reality, Redford was drawn to another path. In Boulder, instead of focusing on baseball and studies, he plunged into drinking, partying, and high-speed car races. On one occasion, his car flipped while he was driving at 90 miles per hour, a near-death accident that served as a stark warning of his self-destructive spiral. His reckless lifestyle cost him his scholarship, and eventually, he was expelled. At 19, Robert Redford had gone from a promising student-athlete to a dropout with no degree and no direction. But that fall opened a new path. He left America and wandered through Europe like a pilgrim in search of himself. In Florence, Italy, he studied painting and survived by doing illustration work. In Paris, he drifted through cafes frequented by artists, lived in a damp little room, and survived on stale bread. Amidst poverty, Redford discovered freedom and a sense of belonging to the artistic world. His paintbrush became more than a means of survival. It was a tool for healing and for capturing pieces of his inner self. After several years, he returned to the United States, this time carrying a new sense of confidence. He wanted to become an artist, not an athlete or an office worker. Redford enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, where he learned to master his voice, his expressions, and to transform his experiences of loss and failure into the raw material of performance. His painful past became his greatest asset as an actor. His first steps on Broadway came with Tall Story, but it wasn't until 1963 that he truly broke through with Neil Simon's play Barefoot in the Park. As Paul Bratter, the young lawyer newly married, Redford brought charm, humor, and a disarming authenticity. Every line, every glance made audiences laugh and then fall silent in recognition. The theater was packed night after night, and Robert Redford's name was firmly etched onto the map of New York theater. From a young man expelled from school and scraping by as a painter in Europe, Redford had transformed himself into a Broadway star. And from there, Hollywood's spotlight began to call his name. The silver screen star. In the mid-1960s, Robert Redford began leaving his first marks on Hollywood. In Inside Daisy Clover, 1965, he played a charming yet tragic young man opposite Natalie Wood, his former high school classmate from Van Nuys. The role immediately revealed that Redford was more than just a handsome face. He carried fragility, a quiet sadness behind those bright blue eyes. Just a year later, in This Property is Condemned, 1966, also alongside Wood, he portrayed a love crushed by society, cementing his image as a romantic leading man who could evoke both sympathy and heartache. The real turning point came with Barefoot in the Park, 1967, the film adaptation of the Broadway play that had made his name. On screen, Redford carried over the wit and humor of young husband Paul Bratter, but this time his charm reached millions of moviegoers. The film established him as one of Hollywood's most promising new stars, ready for a leap to the next level. That leap came in 1969. In Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Redford embodied the Sundance Kid, a quick-draw cowboy, quiet, yet fiercely loyal. Opposite Paul Newman's witty and talkative Butch Cassidy, the two created a legendary on-screen partnership. At a time when Hollywood was reinventing the Western, the film not only revitalized the genre, but also made Redford an international icon. From then on, Sundance was no longer just a character's name. It became a lifelong moniker for Redford himself. Yet Redford refused to be confined to cowboy roles. Jeremiah Johnson, 1972, saw him portray a man choosing to live in isolation in the Montana wilderness. In every silent frame, Redford conveyed profound melancholy, echoing his own memories of childhood loss. The film became an emblem of American individualism, with Redford as its perfect embodiment. That same year, he starred in The Candidate, 1972, a biting political drama. As young presidential candidate Bill McKay, Redford exposed the dark underbelly of American politics, empty slogans, and dirty compromises. At a time when the nation was shaken by war and disillusionment, the film positioned Redford as an unofficial spokesman for a skeptical generation. 1973 marked a double peak. The Way We Were, opposite Barbra Streisand, became one of cinema's most enduring love stories. As Hubble Gardner, the charming man too weak to embrace Katie's Streisand's fiery love, Redford was both irresistible and infuriating, showing he could portray men as flawed as they were desirable. Just months later, he reunited with Paul Newman in The Sting, a dazzling con artist caper that won 7 Oscars. As Johnny Hooker, Redford was quick-witted yet sincere, pulling audiences into a game of deception with equal parts suspense and charm. The film dominated the box office and earned Redford an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, a pinnacle any star would envy. Never content with safe roles, Redford embraced darker material. 3 Days of the Condor, 1975, was a paranoid spy thriller reflecting America's post-Watergate anxieties. As a CIA analyst hunted by his own agency, Redford embodied confusion, fear, and quiet defiance, an image that resonated with a nation losing faith in its government. Then came All the President's Men, 1976, where he played journalist Bob Woodward. Alongside Dustin Hoffman, Redford dramatized the Watergate investigation that brought down a president. The film was both an artistic triumph and a political statement, with Redford at its center. In the early 1980s, his roles deepened further. In Brubaker, 1980, he portrayed a prison warden who dared to confront a corrupt system. By Out of Africa, 1985, he returned as a romantic figure opposite Meryl Streep, set against the sweeping landscapes of Africa. The film won 7 Oscars and cemented Redford's stature as the last great man of Hollywood cinema, at once strong and tender. Even in middle age, Redford retained his box office power. He embraced diverse projects: Sneakers, 1992, a tech-centered thriller; Indecent Proposal, 1993, controversial for his role as a billionaire offering $1 million for a night of love; and Spy Game, 2001, where he teamed with Brad Pitt in a tense espionage drama. But Redford was never drawn to easy roles. At 77, he starred in All Is Lost, 2013, a near-wordless one-man film about a lone sailor adrift at sea. Every ounce of tension, exhaustion, and determination was conveyed through his eyes, his breath, his movements. Critics called it a cinematic soliloquy, praising Redford for laying bare his own fragility on screen. In 2018, Redford officially ended his acting career with The Old Man and The Gun. As a gentlemanly aging outlaw, the role felt like a full-circle echo of the Sundance Kid decades earlier. It was not just a farewell performance, but a reflection. Redford looking back at his journey from the young cowboy who became a legend to the man who had lived through every peak and abyss of a lifetime in cinema, becoming a masterful director. At the height of his acting career, Robert Redford did not choose to rest in the comfort of stardom. Instead, he stepped behind the camera, a risky but logical move for a man who always wanted to control the way stories were told. And astonishingly, with his very first film, Ordinary People, 1980, Redford created a milestone in cinema history. The film told the story of an American middle-class family that seemed perfect on the surface, but shattered after the death of the eldest son. Redford avoided flashy effects or reliance on major stars. Instead, he focused on silence, glances, and the growing emotional distance within the family. The film struck a chord with millions of American families who carried similar hidden grief, and it became a sensation. Ordinary People won 4 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director for Redford, an extraordinary feat for a first-time filmmaker. It proved that Redford was more than a beautiful face on screen. He was a sharp observer of the human condition, capable of turning personal wounds into universal art. Following that triumph, Redford continued to explore stories of family and American identity. A River Runs Through It, 1992, was not just a film about 2 brothers raised under the stern hand of a minister father. Beneath the breathtaking images of Montana's rivers and landscapes, Redford embedded a philosophy: nature as a mirror of life, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always flowing forward. The film carried audiences back to childhood, where family memories intertwined with the passage of time. Unsurprisingly, it earned an Oscar nomination for Best Cinematography and remains one of the most poetic portrayals of the American West ever made. 2 years later, Redford tackled a more unsettling story with Quiz Show, 1994. Based on a real-life scandal from the 1950s American television, the film exposed how a popular quiz program manipulated its results to boost ratings. Redford went beyond recounting a scandal. He raised questions about morality, ambition, and the manipulation of the public, themes that remain relevant today. The film received critical acclaim and Oscar nominations for both Best Picture and Best Director, solidifying Redford as a filmmaker with his own distinct voice, one unafraid to probe the cracks in American society. In 1998, Redford directed and starred in The Horse Whisperer. The film blended the spirit of the American West with a family tragedy, telling the story of a young girl traumatized by an accident and the man who could speak to horses, a metaphor for healing. Redford infused the film with his deep love of nature and mastery of visual storytelling, creating a work both expansive and intimate. He continued experimenting with different genres, from The Legend of Bagger Vance, 2000, a philosophical tale hidden within the game of golf, to Lions for Lambs, 2007, a political drama that dissected disappointment and division in post-9/11 America. While not every film was a commercial triumph, each bore Redford's unmistakable imprint, that of a director deeply concerned with truth, morality, and the struggles of individuals caught in life's unforgiving machinery. If on screen Redford embodied charm and freedom, then behind the camera he became a voice of conscience and human depth. Founder and producer, Robert Redford did not stop at the glory of the screen or the director's chair. He chose to inscribe his name in film history in another way, by founding, nurturing, and giving opportunities to the next generation. In 1981, in the mountains of Utah, where he had found the stillness to balance his life, Redford established the Sundance Institute. At the time, his goal was simple: to create a space where young filmmakers could experiment, train, and find their own voices without being shackled by Hollywood's rigid commercial rules. From that foundation, just a few years later, the Sundance Film Festival was born and quickly became a cultural phenomenon. Unlike the glamour of Cannes or the classical artistry of Venice, Sundance embraced boldness and authenticity. It became the place where unknown voices were heard, where small but powerful films found their audiences. From this cradle, Quentin Tarantino emerged with Reservoir Dogs, Steven Soderbergh made waves with Sex, Lies, and Videotape, Darren Aronofsky stunned with Pi, and more recently, Chloe Zhao introduced Nomadland, a film that went on to win the Oscar. People call Sundance a cultural revolution in American cinema, but for Redford, it was simply about restoring fairness to art, giving personal, daring, and truthful stories a chance to survive in a market dominated by profit. At the same time, Redford used his reputation and influence to support projects that otherwise would have struggled to find funding. He quietly backed young directors who dared to tell difficult stories, who confronted truths Hollywood often avoided. If his acting and directing career proved his individual talent, then Sundance and his role as a producer showed a broader vision. He wanted to build a legacy, ensuring American cinema was not defined solely by glossy blockbusters. What set him apart was not only what he did, but how he approached art. Redford always chose restraint. On screen, he never overplayed emotions or relied on heavy dialogue. A glance, a turn of the head, often carried more weight than an entire monologue. In an era when Hollywood favored dramatic displays, he leaned into silence and turned it into his own language. For this, Redford became an emblem of subtlety. He did not play a role, he lived it. In choosing scripts, Redford consistently gravitated toward characters caught between society, politics, and power. From The Candidate to All the President's Men to 3 Days of the Condor, he told stories that reflected not just individual lives, but the broader American landscape. When he moved into directing, he remained faithful to that principle. Ordinary People was a haunting family portrait. A river runs through. It turned nature into a metaphor for life's current, and Quiz Show exposed the moral decay of the media. In all of them, Redford was never concerned with glamour. He was concerned with human fractures, the parts of us that last. Robert Redford proved that film is not just entertainment, but a medium to stir, to challenge, and to open new doors in the viewer's mind. For him, cinema was both an art and a responsibility. And through that conviction, he transformed himself from a charming leading man into a cultural symbol, a steadfast storyteller for more than half a century. Personal life. Robert Redford's journey in love began with an impulsive yet passionate decision. In 1958, barely in his early 20s and with nothing to his name, he eloped with Lola Van Wagenen, a young woman from Provo, Utah, despite fierce objections from her family. Their wedding was modest and unadorned, but it was filled with faith that love could withstand any hardship. In those early days of marriage, they lived in small apartments, surviving on the meager income from Redford's odd jobs, clinging to the fragile hope that a career in film would eventually smile on them. But just as joy began to take root, tragedy struck. In 1959, their firstborn son, Scott, died suddenly at only 10 weeks old from sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. The loss left a scar that never healed. Redford later admitted that for the rest of his life he asked himself if there was anything he could have done to save his baby boy. It was a grief that neither fame nor success could ever erase. Slowly, the Redfords found hope again as more children came into their lives. Shauna, their eldest daughter, was born in 1960. She chose a life far from Hollywood's glare and became an artist. Yet tragedy found her too. In 1983, her boyfriend, journalism student Sid Wells, was mysteriously murdered in his University of Colorado dorm. The case was never solved, leaving Shauna and the Redford family haunted for years. Their second son, James Redford, born in 1962, embodied both artistic talent and cruel misfortune. Diagnosed with a rare liver disease as a child, he underwent 2 liver transplants to survive. Instead of succumbing, James turned his hardship into purpose. He became a documentary filmmaker and social activist, particularly in environmental issues and organ donation. He was Robert's pride, not only as a son, but also as an ally in his ideals. Yet fate was merciless once more. In 2020, James died at 58 from liver cancer, a loss that devastated Redford. He said James was not only his son, but also my friend, my teacher, and the greatest inspiration of my life. In 1970, the family welcomed their youngest, Amy. Full of energy, Amy followed in her father's footsteps to become an actress and director, working across film and theater. Unlike her siblings, Amy embraced Hollywood's spotlight without being overshadowed by her father's towering legacy. Through her work, she gave voice to women and the marginalized, continuing her family's legacy in her own way. For 27 years, Lola Van Wagenen was Redford's greatest anchor. She endured the hardships with him, shared the pain of losing a child, and raised their children while he was consumed by building his career. But as Redford became increasingly absorbed in work and fame, the distance between them grew. In 1985, they ended their marriage. To the press, Redford described it as a balanced and right decision, but the reality was harsher. After the divorce, he spiraled into depression, isolating himself, living on cigarettes and coffee instead of meals, and writing dozens of letters to Lola, letters that never received a reply. Despite the end, Redford never hid his admiration for Lola. He repeatedly called her his true love and the greatest pillar of my life. To him, without Lola, there would have been no Robert Redford as the world knows him, both as an artist and as a man who found the strength to rise again from ruin. After nearly 3 decades of marriage ended, Redford entered an emotional void that no quick fix could fill. He drifted through short-lived romances, each woman leaving a mark, each relationship serving as a temporary balm after heartbreak. In 1987, Redford met Sonia Braga, the Brazilian actress famous for her wild beauty and fiery spirit. They quickly fell into a passionate affair, appearing hand in hand at Cannes, commanding attention on the red carpet. Sonia brought Redford raw energy, instinctive, bold, dramatic. But that same intensity burned too fast. Within less than a year, their romance ended, leaving behind vivid but fleeting memories. 3 years later, while filming Havana, 1990, Redford was swept into another affair, this time with co-star Lena Olin. Amid the chaotic backdrop of Cuba in the story, their on-screen chemistry spilled into real life. With Lena, Redford found a love that was artistic and romantic, but fragile. They shared deep conversations and long creative nights, but fame's pressures and differences in lifestyle proved too great. When filming ended, so did their chapter, like a book never fully written. Between fiery loves and fading romances, Redford found unexpected calm with Kathy O'Rear, an unheralded costume designer. Kathy brought not glamour but stability and quiet understanding, offering Redford respite in his unsteady years after divorce. Their relationship did not last long, but it taught him to slow down and seek balance instead of escaping into work or fleeting passion. Each woman who passed through Redford's life after divorce was like a pause, sometimes fire, sometimes wind, sometimes a soft blanket, but none stayed long enough to become a harbor. Only with Sibylle Sagars, years later, did he finally find the lasting peace neither youth nor middle age had offered him. By the late 1990s, Redford met the woman who would become his true home, Sibylle Sagars, a German environmental artist. They first encountered each other at Sundance Resort, founded by Redford, and itself a symbol of his devotion to both art and nature. Sibylle was there to exhibit her work, and from their earliest conversations, Redford was drawn to her calmness and creativity. Unlike his past partners, Sibylle had no interest in Hollywood glamour. She saw Redford not as a movie legend, but as a man who had endured deep wounds and needed empathy. Her sincerity allowed Redford to feel he could simply be himself, without the burden of star image. Over time, they became soulmates, sharing passions for both art and nature. After more than a decade together, they wed in July 2009 in Hamburg, Germany, Sibylle's homeland. It was a warm, intimate ceremony, far from the spotlight, attended only by close family and friends. At 72, Redford entered marriage again, not with the impulsiveness of youth, but with the maturity and calm of a man who had survived profound loss. The couple chose not to have children together. Redford explained that at their age, they understood happiness was not tied to having more children, but in nurturing shared values. He already had 4 children from his first marriage, and Sibylle chose to walk alongside him as a life partner and creative collaborator. Their marriage became intertwined with nature. They settled at Redford's longtime ranch in Utah, where they launched The Way of the Rain, an environmental art project blending performance, music, and visuals to raise awareness about climate change. At events, Sibylle led the artistic vision while Redford used his deep, resonant voice to deliver the message. Redford once said, "Sibylle has given me an entirely new life." After losing children and enduring divorce, he found in her understanding and peace. Amid Utah's mountains, they embraced a simple life, far from Hollywood's glare, dedicated to art, the environment, and family. With Sibylle, Robert Redford finally found a love not loud, but deep enough to soothe the wounds of a lifetime. Yet Redford's private life cannot be defined only by marriages or romances. Alongside them were special relationships with colleagues, bonds not labeled as love but just as meaningful. Among them, Jane Fonda left the deepest mark. They co-starred in multiple films, including Barefoot in the Park and The Electric Horseman. Jane admitted she had fallen for Redford, drawn to both his looks and his soul. But they never crossed the line of friendship. Redford respected Jane, and Jane cherished him as the ideal colleague. Between them existed a special bond, unnamed but enduring through decades. Another connection that drew public attention was with Candice Bergen, his co-star in The Hunting Party. Rumors of romance swirled, though never confirmed. Candice's intelligence, beauty, and sharp wit fueled the belief that their connection had gone beyond the screen. But as always, Redford chose silence, his way of protecting relationships, preserving their dignity rather than feeding tabloid spectacle. If romances left scars, these friendships offered balance. They proved that beyond fame, tragedy, and heartbreak, Redford still preserved ties of purity. Relationships built not on reputation, but on sincerity, legacy, and influence. Robert Redford did more than leave behind roles that shaped cinema history. He changed the way the world looked at artists. Over more than 6 decades, he built the image of a handsome yet understated leading man, a star with undeniable box office appeal who nonetheless refused to become an empty symbol. His restrained style of acting, few words, powerful glances, became his own language in a Hollywood that often thrived on spectacle. He proved that sometimes silence speaks louder than dialogue. As a director, Redford showed he was far more than a golden face on screen. Ordinary People, 1980, was not simply an Oscar-winning film. It was a statement. Redford had the vision to tell profound stories about human beings, families, and emotional wounds. Later films such as A River Runs Through It, Quiz Show, and The Horse Whisperer carried that same sensibility. Quiet, subtle, yet piercingly attuned to pain and the fragility of life. Yet his greatest legacy lies in Sundance. In 1981, by founding the Sundance Institute and later the Sundance Film Festival, Redford opened an entirely new path for American cinema. Sundance was not only the launch pad for Quentin Tarantino, Steven Soderbergh, Darren Aronofsky, Chloe Zhao, and hundreds of other independent filmmakers, it also proved that small, truthful, daring stories could move the world. What began as a modest idea in Utah grew into a global symbol of independent cinema, a cultural revolution with Redford as its soul. Beyond the arts, Redford became a powerful voice in society. For decades, he advocated for the environment, fought to protect national parks, spoke out against climate change, and opposed projects like the Keystone XL pipeline. He frequently addressed the United Nations and worked with organizations such as the Natural Resources Defense Council. For Redford, an artist's duty was not just to entertain, but to shoulder responsibility for the planet and community. His legacy extends beyond cinema and politics. It lives within his own family. His son, James Redford, carried forward his father's passion for filmmaking and environmental activism. His daughter, Amy, continues as a director, while his grandson, Dylan, explores independent cinema. Across generations, the spirit Redford instilled, to live for art and for community, endures. Today, when people think of Robert Redford, they remember more than Sundance Kid, All the President's Men, or Out of Africa. They remember an artist who turned pain into strength, a man who transformed a personal career into a cultural movement, and a voice that became a tool for change. His legacy is not the fleeting glamour of Hollywood, but a lasting one, a symbol of integrity, of humanistic art, and of tireless commitment to making a difference. Present life. In his 80s, Robert Redford announced his retirement from acting after The Old Man and the Gun, 2018. Yet for an artist who never truly knew how to stop, retirement has only meant stepping away from Hollywood's noise, not falling into silence. He continues to live through creativity, through painting, through environmental projects, and, at times, through unexpected returns. In early 2025, at the age of 88, Redford astonished the world by making a surprise appearance in Dark Winds Season 3. It was just a 30-second cameo, playing a prisoner in a chess game with George R.R. Martin, without a single line of dialogue, but enough to leave audiences breathless. He requested the scene be filmed on a closed set, without fanfare or announcements, as if offering a quiet farewell to the screen after 6 years away. That brief moment revealed a Redford who no longer sought glory, but simply wished to reconnect with art in its simplest form. That same year, the Sundance Film Festival, the institution he founded in 1981, held its final season in Utah, where Redford had poured his heart into transforming barren land into a sanctuary for independent cinema. The organizers dedicated a special program to honor him, recognizing Redford as the soul of a cultural movement that changed how the world saw American film. For him, it was more than personal pride. It was proof that a dream had come true, a space where even the smallest voices could be heard. Outside of these rare public milestones, Redford chooses a private life with his wife, German environmental artist Sibylle Sagars, at their expansive ranch in Utah. Together they continue The Way of the Rain, an art and environment project where Sibylle creates, and Redford lends his resonant voice to inspire. He spends much of his time painting, his first passion from youth, and finds peace in nature, the healing light that has carried him through a lifetime of loss. Family remains at the center. Though he lost 2 sons, Scott as an infant and James in 2020, he finds solace in his daughters, Shauna and Amy, and in his 7 grandchildren. In a rare reflection, Redford said, "My grandchildren are the little lights guiding my old age, especially as grandson Dylan follows in his footsteps, even inviting him to lend his voice to an independent animated film. It is proof that his legacy lives not only in Hollywood, but in his very bloodline." Now, Robert Redford no longer seeks recognition. He chooses peace, chooses to contribute quietly to art and the environment, and chooses to live beside the woman who has walked with him through his later years. Yet, when Sundance 2025 draws its curtain, or when his fleeting cameo appears unexpectedly on screen, one thing becomes clear. Robert Redford is still there, an icon who never truly disappears, an artist who transformed both glory and grief into strength, living fully until the very end. Robert Redford was never the kind of legend who lived only in the spotlight. He chose to step back, letting his films, his ideas, and the movements he championed speak for themselves. That's why, even at nearly 90, his name is still spoken with respect, not for a single role, but for a spirit of commitment, creativity, and resilience. In a world where glamour so often overshadows true value, Redford reminds us that a great life isn't measured by awards or box office records. It's measured by the way a person dares to turn loss into motivation, to persist in defending art and nature, and to live by their own convictions. If Robert Redford has ever moved you, through a glance on screen, a role, or his unwavering spirit beyond Hollywood, hit like to honor him. And tell us, to you, is he an actor, a director, or a cultural revolutionary? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the stories behind the legend.